Okay, well, we're gonna start this morning off with an informal survey really quick, which is I need a show of hands if you've ever been in a church service of any kind, any context, where you've talked about Herod's slaughter of innocents in Matthew chapter 2, okay? Yeah, okay. Good news for everyone is that after today, we can all raise our hand on that one. So what we're gonna do is this morning, we've been in this series, Behold Your King, right? And we have been thinking about what does it look like for us to behold Jesus as the King of our lives? What does it look like for us at this Christmas to declare Jesus as the King of our lives? And this morning, what we're gonna do a little bit is think about the ways that anytime we declare Jesus as King, there's going to be things that compete with Jesus for that title. There's going to be things that compete with Jesus in that moment. And what we have to do is we have to think about how do we protect that throne for Jesus? How do we have to guard that throne for Jesus? And to do this, we're going to be looking in Matthew chapter 2, starting in verse 13, if you want to open up there. And we pick up the story where we find Herod the Great, who is king of Judea, competing with Jesus for the throne at the time, what he perceived as for the throne of Judea at the time. And so if you were here last week, you heard Pastor Bumble talking about the arrival of the Magi. And he talked about the way that the Magi first stopped in Jerusalem and they met Herod there. And Herod sent them on their way to go, and they arrived finding Jesus. And there an angel appeared to the Magi, basically told them, don't go back to Herod, because Herod's going to try to kill Jesus. And so the Magi went their own way. And the story that we see here basically picks up right there as the Magi are leaving. We see the story pick up in Matthew chapter 2, starting in verse 13. It says, when they'd gone, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream, they being the Magi. Get up, he said, take the child and his mother and escape to Egypt. Stay there until I tell you, for Herod is going to search for the child to kill him. So he got up, took the child and his mother during the night and left for Egypt, where he stayed until the death of Herod. And so was fulfilled what the Lord had said through the prophet, out of Egypt I called my son. When Herod realized that he'd been outwitted by the Magi, he was furious, and he gave orders to kill all the boys in Bethlehem and its vicinity who were 2 years old and under, in accordance with the time he had learned from the Magi. Then what was said through the prophet Jeremiah was fulfilled. A voice is heard in Ramah, weeping in great mourning, Rachel weeping for her children and refusing to be comforted because they are no more. We're gonna stop there. And you can see for a second why this isn't a normal part of our Advent cycle, right? This doesn't come up in all of our Advent preaching because for the most part, it doesn't give us the warm, fuzzy feelings that Christmas is supposed to give us, right? Like it's hot cocoa and fireplaces and Hallmark movies. But if this was a Hallmark, it's a very bad Hallmark movie at this point, right? This is not good. This is not what we want for Christmas. We don't usually think about Christmas as being a time with like bloodthirsty rulers competing for a throne in some really vicious ways. It's like this is like the Game of Thrones version of Christmas, right? And so that's not what we want at Christmas. That's not what we're used to. And yet for some reason, the story is here in the middle of the rest of the Christmas narrative that we're all so used to. And we see that from the very beginning that there were things that were competing with Jesus for the throne. There were people who were competing with Jesus for the throne. Herod was here competing with Jesus for this throne. And we hear this exhortation now, right, to behold your king. And for us, that sounds nice. It sounds kind of Christmassy. It sounds like whatever. It's not this big thing. And yet back then it wasn't any of that. It was a powerful declaration that there was a new king who had entered into this world. And Herod took that declaration very seriously, right? To the point that he sent his soldiers to Bethlehem, to a town of about 600 people, we think at the time, and ordered them to kill all the 2-year-olds and under in that community. Imagine how horrifying that is for a town of 600 people, all of their children, basically. It's a horrifying thing. And yet the angel arrived first, right, and warned Joseph what was coming. And so they fled to Egypt, and in verse 19, the story picks up. It says, after Herod died, an angel of the Lord appeared in a dream to Joseph in Egypt and said, get up, take the child and his mother and go to the land of Israel, for those who were trying to take the child's life are dead." So he got up, took the child and his mother, and went to the land of Israel. But when he heard that Archelaus was reigning in Judea in place of his father Herod, he was afraid to go there. Having been warned in a dream, he withdrew to the district of Galilee, and he went and lived in a town called Nazareth. So was fulfilled what was said through the prophets, that he would be called a Nazarene. And so Joseph has this vision. The angel comes to him, says, "Flee." And so Joseph takes the family and they go to Egypt. And it struck me as we were getting ready for this, so often, we've seen the Christmas carol. Oh no, I've forgotten the name of the Christmas carol. "Angels we have heard on high." I've said it in multiple, yes, Sandra's saying yes, okay. There's the line in it that says, "Mary, Joseph, lend your aid," right, to Jesus. And I've been thinking, what aid are they aiding? And yet here's Joseph lending aid in this moment to Jesus, protecting Jesus. He hears what the angel has to warn him about. They flee from Herod. They go to Egypt. They're safe. And when the time comes, they go home. They're led by the angel back. And as we approach Christmas this year, as we declare Jesus to be the King of our lives this Christmas, we want to think about the things that are competing with Jesus for that claim too. We want to think about the fact that there will always be things competing for the throne in your life. That's always going to be true, just like Herod was ready to compete with Jesus 2,000 years ago. Herod was no stranger to fighting for the throne. And if we want to understand the story in Matthew 2, I think it's helpful a little bit to understand about Herod's life for a second. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to invite you into my classroom for a second, okay? And I'll say this, I haven't gotten to preach in a couple months because I've gotten sick every time I'm supposed to preach. It's worked out great for you guys, but that means that I have all this nerdy stuff I have pent up that I need to get out. So just buckle up for today on that front. So this is our classroom here for a second about Herod the Great. And Herod was the first of the Herodian kings of Judea. And he started his own line of kings here in this moment. And Herod took the throne from the Hasmonean kings who came before him for about 200 years. And it's important to know about Herod's life is that his life started relatively unknown. He was a small political figure. In 47 BCE, he was appointed the governor of Galilee, which was a tiny little province in Israel at the time. And the expectation, his role was that he would simply oversee the tax collectors of Galilee. That was his job, was to make sure the money came in. And he did that for a while until he started to get ambitious. And in 41 BCE, Herod decided that it was time to abandon his first wife and first son, his son's name Antipater, and abandon them because he wanted a more politically useful marriage for himself. And so he went and he didn't just abandon them, he actually banished the two of them, his wife and his son. You have to get out of Israel, you cannot be here anymore, I don't want to be around you. So he banishes them away. And in some bad turn of luck, Herod got himself stuck in a civil war in 39. The king of Judea before that he supported was defeated. So Herod found himself on the losing side of a civil war. And so what he did was he went to Rome in 37, he went to Rome and he asked the Roman Senate to send an army to make the old king again. Give us back the old king, please. And the Roman Senate decided instead of doing that, they were just going to make Herod the king of Judea. So they voted in that moment to make him king and sent him back with an army and said, you deal with it. You take charge of this situation. And so that's what he did. He ended up marrying this woman named Mariamne, who was the daughter of the old king, to get himself that more powerful marriage for himself. And at this point, he fought a civil war, took the throne for himself. And in 10 years, he went from being this regional little governor to the entire Roman client king of Judea. It's a huge step up for Herod. But he wasn't done because things get a little difficult for him. I asked this in the last two services, and you can guess more on 8:30, not 9:45, but have people read Julius Caesar ever, the play? Yeah, high school students should have probably. Yeah, okay, cool. Great. So, and the English teacher. Yes, good. Yeah, okay. So in the year, what is it, 35-ish, 39-ish, 37-ish, somewhere in there. What's the board say? Yeah, exactly, 36. A civil war broke out in Rome. And you might be familiar with this. Mark Antony and Cleopatra were on one side, Octavian on the other. And everyone in Rome had to choose a side. They had to pick a side for this civil war. And Herod chose Mark Antony's side. Okay, he chose to declare his loyalty to Mark Antony. And I want to be clear, Mark Antony, not Mark Anthony, okay? I worked really hard on this, just so you guys know. That took a long time to hide J-Lo behind Mark Anthony, but it got there. So they have no clue who Mark Anthony is at all. Okay. Sorry guys, sorry, my bad. So Herod declared his loyalty for Mark Antony. His mother-in-law at the time ended up trying to get Herod removed from the throne, right? That's a dicey family situation. And so he actually had his mother-in-law's best friend assassinated in 35. So you can imagine like family gatherings from this point on, really testy events going forward. And then in 31, Mark Antony loses the civil war. He's defeated at the Battle of Actium by Octavian. And Octavian, who's about to be known as Caesar Augustus, goes around the empire arresting basically all the people who sided against him and executing them. He just goes around cleaning up the different states that weren't loyal to him and installing his own loyal people. And when he got to Herod, he went to arrest Herod. We don't know what Herod said to him. We don't know what Herod promised him. But Octavian left Herod in charge of Judea. It's one of the only client states that he left in charge of a king who'd betrayed him. That Herod offered him something, no one knows what it was, that convinced him that it was worth it for him to leave Herod in charge. And so Herod went back to Israel at the end of this war, and it became obvious that there was blood in the water. People were trying to find their ways to usurp the throne from Herod. And so this is the beginning of his sort of reign of terror of sorts. And so in 29, he arrested his wife, Mariamne, for no reason, and he had her executed. 20 years go by, a lot of stuff happens. He builds a lot of stuff. That's how he gets the name Herod the Great, actually. And in 7 BCE, he arrested his second and third sons, Mariamne's kids, and had them executed. In 4 BCE, he went and found his first son that he banished, found him wherever he'd banished him to, arrested him, had him executed. There's a dark irony that he banished him and then had to go find him to go finish the deal here. But he's this bloodthirsty king. He would do whatever it took, anything that it took for him to hold on to the throne. And in that context, Matthew 2 doesn't look that out of character. This is just the kind of king that Herod was. He wanted this throne no matter the costs. He was willing to do whatever it took to hold on to the throne in this way. And each and every one of us has Herods in our lives that are competing for the throne today. We have Herods in our lives that are just as bloodthirsty, just as power hungry, just as committed to holding on to the throne of our lives as Herod was as to holding on to the throne of Judea 2,000 years ago. Your greed sees Jesus as a threat to its place on the throne, and it will do whatever it takes to hold on to it. The expectations that you need to meet the expectations that others place on you sees Jesus as a threat to its place on the throne, and those expectations will lie through their teeth to get you to leave them on the throne instead of Jesus. Your need for achievement, for success, to be able to say you accomplished something, sees Jesus as a threat to its place on the throne of your life, and it will kill whatever relationships, whatever callings you have in your life in an effort to hold on to the throne for itself. your control, your desire for approval, your constant focus on your own comfort, the need to avoid conflict, the money you want to have, the status you want to achieve, all of it can be a Herod in your life that's just as bloodthirsty, just as power hungry, just as willing to do whatever it takes to keep Jesus from having his rightful place on the throne of your life. And so if we're going to say that Jesus is the king of our lives, that we're going to behold Jesus as the king in this moment, then we're going to have to figure out, what does it look like? Can we give them a round of applause really quick? Yeah. Oh no, you broke it. On the last one, good job, Owen. Okay, but if we're going to behold Jesus as the king of our lives, then we have to think about, what does it look like for us to protect that throne for Jesus? What does it look like for us to ensure that the throne is protected for Jesus in this way? And I think we can take two strategies from Joseph's example. And the first is to flee from your Herods. That you would flee from the Herods in your life. You wouldn't fight them, you would flee from them. Right, when the angel appeared to Joseph and said that Herod is going to try to come and to kill Jesus, Joseph's response wasn't to go and get a suit of armor and a sword, right, and go off to battle. It wasn't to go into the town square and rally support for his cause. He fled. He took Jesus, he took Mary, and they fled to Egypt. And yet so often, we want to fight the Herods in our lives. We think that with sheer willpower, like mind over matter somehow, we can defeat whatever is encroaching on Jesus' throne in our lives, right? We say you're struggling with addiction, you fight it. You're struggling with greed, you fight it. You're struggling with meeting people's expectations, you fight it. But here's the thing, that the Herods in your life are survivors, just like Herod the Great. If we try to fight those things, there's a very real possibility we lose to them, that they defeat us, that they overwhelm us, that they hold on to the throne against our will. That's why I think the Apostle Paul in 1 Corinthians 6, he encouraged the Corinthians, he said, flee from sexual immorality, right? And the word he used here in Greek in 1 Corinthians 6 is this word fugo, which becomes the word like refuge, but it means to flee, like quite literally to flee from something. In the Iliad, Hector fugoed away from Achilles after in the battle. An army would fugo away from the opposing army after they'd been crushed in battle. The people of Rome would fugo away from the barbarian hordes when they were left defenseless, right? This was to run away, to flee with no shame, no sense of how you looked, no sense of what appearances you might have. This was just to basically to run as quickly as possible, to get away from a situation. And it says here in Matthew 2 that Joseph fugoed away with Mary and Jesus to Egypt. They fled from Herod. Not an organized retreat, not like a tactical withdrawal. They ran for their lives all the way to Egypt. And so when we're confronted with a Herod in our lives, our response should be to flee from it, to run away from it, to get away from it, to fugo away, just as Joseph did with Herod, just as Paul encouraged the Corinthians to run. And that's basically the advice that we give teenagers, right? By and large, that's the kind of advice, if you're raising teenagers or you've raised teenagers, that's usually the advice we give to them about these sorts of things, right? If there's something in their lives that we think is a temptation that could be a Herod in their lives, the advice is flee from it. Right? If someone's struggling with something, they're struggling with friends that are leading them in the wrong direction, our advice is often to them, flee from those friends, find different friends. If someone is struggling with all sorts of temptations with their phone or something, our advice to them is to, well, don't take your phone with you when you go somewhere private, right? Flee from it. Our advice all the time to teenagers is to flee from the things that are tempting them. Flee from the Herods in their lives. Don't put yourselves in that situation. And yet when it comes to our Herods, that's rarely the advice we give. That's rarely the response we invite people to take. When's the last time you heard someone talking about struggling with feeling like they want more and more money, and you heard someone respond to them and say, hey, you know what you should do? You should just delete all the investment apps off your phone. You should flee from that. When's the last time you heard someone sharing about how it's hard, their schedule is so impacted, their kids' schedules are so impacted, and the response you heard someone share with them was, you know what you should do? You should flee from that. You should just start from a clean slate. Just wipe that out and start over. In part, I think, because we don't see our Herods in the same sort of way. Sometimes we think that we can leave Jesus and Herod on the throne at the same time. We'll squeeze it, we'll make it work together. Sometimes it's because we don't think the Herods in our lives are actually Herods to begin with. There's nothing wrong with them. Maybe they started off good at some point in time. Maybe they have good benefits in our life. And so we want to hold on to them. I mean, Herod got the name Herod the Great somehow. He did great things. That's how he got the name. That doesn't mean he was good. And we look at things in our lives and they're good things that have become something else. Our desire for our kids to succeed in certain ways it starts off as a good impulse, but it becomes an idol eventually. An idol in our lives that won't give up the throne to Jesus. Our searching for security and for stability started off as a good thing maybe, but it shifted to the point that we're not willing to risk that security and stability if Jesus calls us to. Our desire to maintain peace begins as a good thing, and it begins well enough, but eventually it gets to the point where we're not willing to enter conflict even when Jesus calls us to enter into a conflict. And yet the strategy that Joseph modeled for us is for all of us. It's to flee from these things. Flee from those Herods in your life. To flee from your greed, to flee from your selfishness, to flee from your need to be in control. To flee from your idolatry, to flee from your lust, to flee from your craving for success. Even to flee from those things that might look good, might have been good at some point, but you realize they won't let Jesus have the throne in your life. And once you've fled, once you've gotten yourself into Egypt, it's important to note that there's more to the story, okay? There's more to it than just that. It's not just to flee from all this. We have to then stop and we have to listen and follow God's direction. We're gonna have to listen for and follow God's direction in our lives. Mary and Joseph and Jesus, we know they lived about 3 years in Egypt, but the story doesn't end in Egypt, right? The story doesn't end with Joseph fleeing to Egypt away from Herod. There's a moment where they're invited back into something more, where they're called into something more in life. And I think it's often easy for us to get hung up on this step right here, because it's easy for us to see the Christian life as a life that is a life absent of bad things. That what it means to be a Christian, what it means to be a follower of Jesus is that we abstain from bad things, or maybe not even bad things, we just abstain from certain things. A few weeks ago, we hosted something here in the worship center for some people that weren't really connected to the church, and they were kind of in the back pews over there, and I was sitting in the corner kind of praying for them and trying not to eavesdrop, but also eavesdropping a little bit on their conversations. And as they were talking, one of the women, she started to say was probably the most profane sentence I've ever heard someone share in the worship center, okay? It just went on for an extended period of time. And as she came to the end of that sentence, everyone around her kind of jumped on her for a second. And they snapped at her and they said, you're in a church. You can't say that right now, right? As if God hasn't heard those words before or something. But what struck me as I was sitting in the back listening to the whole conversation and the way the conversation went after this was that for them, their concept of being a follower of Jesus was that it was a life absent cussing. That's what it meant to follow Jesus, was that it was just absent these bad things. That's all it was. And of course, there are things that Jesus calls us to abstain from. There's things Paul talks about abstaining from. There's things that the law and the prophets call us to abstain from. There's all sorts of things that as followers of Jesus, our lives are supposed to be absent. But the Christian life isn't a life that's just a life marked by the things that it's missing. There's also an invitation for us into something more, into a full life that Jesus has for us. It's not enough for us to just flee from our Herods. We have to also embrace something else. It's not enough for us to just say yes to Jesus in this moment and to flee from Herod into Egypt to get ourselves out of the circumstances. We have to go and live out the thing that we're called to. There's a positive invitation on our lives. Joseph didn't just flee from Herod into Egypt and live the rest of his life there, right? That's not how the story ends. They heard from God that the time had come. They went back to Israel. They went to Nazareth. There's so much more to this story. If they'd just fled from Herod, that'd be the end of it. They'd be in Egypt. That would have been, I don't know what the story would have been. But they accepted the invitation into something more. And to do that, we have to be people who are willing to listen, who are willing to hear what God has for us, to see the life that he has for us and to put it into practice. Which is tricky for us at Christmas, right? Because right now is not a season of listening for most of us. It's chaos. It's insane right now. How can we have time to listen in this moment? Just this past week, Jude came up to me for the 37th time. I was sitting on the couch. It was early in the morning. And he said, Dad, will you add this astromech droid to my Christmas list, right? This like Star Wars droid from Star Wars land. And I said, yes, buddy, we'll see, we'll put it on the list, whatever. And I did the probably dismissive parent thing at Christmas, kind of like moving on from it. And he came back a second later and he started mumbling. And I was in the zone, I think. I was kind of phased out and he was saying something and I assumed, he was doing the 5-year-old thing of just like coming back again. He's gonna ask me again for the same thing. And so I responded the same way. I said, we'll see, buddy. We'll see what you get for Christmas. And he snapped at me. He said, Dad. And I okay, this is different. And he was like, I said, Luca has her diaper off. And I realized that when he'd come back, what he had done was he's coming to warn me that our 2-year-old was running around the house with her diaper off and I had missed it. And I just assumed that we were still having that same conversation, right? That we're still in that same place. But the reality is that for all of us, whether we're parents or not, Christmas isn't a time of great listening for us. Especially if not of listening to God. We're too focused on too many other things. There's a lot going on all around us right now, a lot for us to deal with right now. And it'd be easy for us to say it's too busy, it's too loud, it's too chaotic, there's too much going on. And yet the beauty of Christmas is that it takes place in the middle of all that chaos, of people's normal lives, of people's everyday lives. Mary and Joseph were just a young couple about to get married when Jesus entered the picture. There's a lot going on there. It's a busy time of life for them. It would have been easy for them to say, we're too busy for whatever Jesus could offer us right now, whatever God has for us right now. The shepherds, they're out in the field doing their jobs. It would have been easy for the shepherds to say, look, we're dealing with something right now. We're working right now. We don't have time for this. Anna and Simeon were just two old birds in the temple who sat around the temple all day long, every day. It would have been easy for them to be focused on the thousands of other people who would have been in the temple that day instead of being focused on Jesus. And yet in the midst of all the noise and all the chaos and all the daily hustle and bustle of life, Jesus entered into the picture. Jesus broke through into the picture. And if you want Jesus to break through into your life this Christmas, if you're saying, I want Jesus to be the king of my life in this season, I want in this moment to give myself to behold my king, then you're going to have to listen. It's going to require you to listen, to make space for what God has for you. Maybe that comes in the sense of an angel appearing to you. I don't think it's all that common. Much more likely, I think it will come through time spent actually reading the Bible, asking God to lead you. It will come through time spent praying for your friends, for your family, for your 8 to 15, or through moments spent in community, asking people how you can help them, asking people to help you in some circumstances. This past year, I think I've listened to God more in this past year, in a more disciplined fashion, I should say, than I ever have at any other point in my life. It's not easy, right? It takes discipline, it takes training, it takes effort to actually set that time aside. And a couple days ago in the office, I was feeling really proud of this, okay? And I went to work and I probably had a sense of like, I was waiting for my moment to share this at some level. But we're all talking about kind of things that we've done this year a little bit. I probably forced it into the conversation a little bit too. And I was like, yeah, I'm really proud of myself. I've read 12 books this year, the New Testament and the Psalms. I was so proud, right? This was my like, I'm holier than Jackie moment. That was like my big plan in this moment to show off. And then behind me in the office door, I hear Bill go, that's it? Just like a dagger to the heart of this moment that I was so proud of, right? And that's a look into my work environment that I have to put up with. And I decided afterwards, though, I had a moment of like, wow, beat myself up about it. But I realized afterwards, I'm gonna embrace that I'm proud of this for a moment. Because what I've realized this year is that if I wanna be the kind of person who is listening for what God has for me, it's going to require me to be disciplined, to actually listen, to dive into the Bible, to dive into scripture, to dive into prayer, to dive into community in all sorts of ways. Not because the Bible is some like magic book, okay? It's not like gonna talk to you. It's not the Christian Tom Riddle's diary, right? It's not like that. It's that when we spend our time diving in and reading, when we spend our time in prayer, when we spend our time in community, what ends up happening is that it shapes us and it forms us. It helps us understand how we should interact with people the way that Jesus would interact with people. It helps us think about the ways that we have obligations to people, the way that Jesus had obligations to people. It helps us see sometimes the Herods in our life that we need to flee from. It helps us see the places where Jesus is inviting us in a new direction, inviting us into something more. But that all is going to require discipline from us. This constant dance of listening and acting and listening and acting and listening and acting, reading, putting it into practice, praying, putting it into practice, being in community, putting it into practice. It's over and over again. And there's no reason for you not to start now. Maybe you've started already and you say, okay, there's no reason for me not to continue now, but there's no reason for you not to start doing that now. This is the season, the end of the year, right, where we've all probably said this about something, where we've said, oh, I want to do that, but I'll wait till the new year to do it, right? Like in 2 weeks, somehow magically something changes and I'll have resolutions that I care about. These are my last 2 weeks to live it up in the old me. But why not start now? Why not start fleeing from your Herods now? Why not start listening for what God has for you now? You could come to Christmas in a week and have a 7-day streak of actually reading your Bible. You could come to Christmas in a week from now, come up to Christmas with your family and have a 7-day streak of starting your day with 10 minutes of prayer for your family. You could come to Christmas in 7 days and you could have started with 7 days of starting your mornings by sending an encouraging message to someone you know who is struggling. There's no reason to wait to start doing these things, to listen for the direction that God has for you. And so what I want us to do is to take a moment to think about, how can you this week protect Jesus as the king of your life? What can you do this week to protect Jesus as the king of your life? What Herods do you need to flee from? What's competing for the throne in your life? What's trying to crowd Jesus out of that place? And what can you do this week to listen? To actually have time to listen for what God has for you. The direction he's giving you to not just live a life that's absent some bad things, but is filled with these good things that Jesus calls you to. And so this morning, we're gonna close our time together by sharing communion together. And hopefully you got communion elements. And if not, I think they have some in the back for you if you're here. But part of what's so great about this opportunity to take communion together as we close out is the reminder that it's easy for us, I think, to beat ourselves up about our shortcomings sometimes, right? And sometimes that's conviction, and that's a good thing. And we should feel that conviction. It leads us. Sometimes it's more than that. It leaves us feeling guilty and hopeless about things. And the beauty of communion is that it's a reminder that Jesus isn't a king who leaves us in hopelessness, right? He meets us where we're at. He offers us something more where we are at. Despite our sin, despite our failures, despite our shortcomings, He's offering us the opportunity to make him the king of our lives. To once again come before him and say, I don't want all these other things to rule my life. I want you to rule my life. And so as we take communion, I want to invite you, maybe for some of you, you're here this morning and you're thinking, I don't know. I don't know if I've really made Jesus the king of my life before. I don't know if I recognize that Jesus is the king of my life. He's always been there. He's always been off to the side. But I want him to be the king now. And if that's you, I'd love to invite you. You can take a moment during communion now to do just that. To say, I want to behold you as my king. I want you to be my king, nothing else. As we're taking communion, you can come before Jesus, come to the table before Jesus and see the Herods in your life that you need to flee from. Offer them to him. You can see the ways that you need to listen this week and say, Jesus, I'm going to listen in these ways. I want your direction in my life. Remembering the sacrifice that he's made for us. The Apostle Paul in 1 Corinthians said that the Lord Jesus, on the night he was betrayed, took bread, and when he had given thanks, he broke it and said, this is my body, which is for you. Do this in remembrance of me. In the same way, after supper, he took the cup, saying, this cup is the new covenant in my blood. Do this whenever you drink it in remembrance of me. For whenever you eat this bread and drink this cup, you proclaim the Lord's death until he comes. So I invite you, when you're ready, eat and drink in remembrance of him.